I think that William Taylor was a very impressive witness and was very damaging to the president. First of all, as you pointed out, he took very copious notes at almost every conversation. When he put quotes in his opening statement, he said those were direct quotes from what was said. It also doesn't hurt that he has a voice like Edward R. Murrow, so he's a pretty impressive presence up there, and I think very non-political. He went out of his way to talk about what he knew, what he was specifically testament to. The only thing he talked about was a strong feeling that it was in the U.S. national security interests to support Ukraine in the fight against Russia, but he certainly wasn't taking any partisan position.
Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Thursday, November 14th. Along with Joe, Willie, and me, we have White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire, the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, and president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton. NBC News correspondent Heidi Przybyla, former Justice Department spokesman, now an MSNBC Justice and Security analyst, Matt Miller, and historian and author of Soul of America and Rogers Professor of the Presidency at Vanderbilt University, Jon Meacham is with us. He's an NBC News and an MSNBC contributor. Joe, it all started in open testimony yesterday. What a day.
Well, anybody that was expecting a repeat of the testimony of Robert Mueller would have been surprised by what happened yesterday. We had some new revelations, some pretty shocking revelations, and also, though, mainly a lot of steady testimony that continues to blow holes in the Republicans and the White House's defense. So we'll get to that in a little bit. It is something, though, how Republicans are chasing their tails and coming up with laughable defenses that will once again be proven false in the coming days.
Yeah, the revelation from yesterday's impeachment hearing that directly implicates President Trump in the Ukraine scandal. It came from Ambassador Bill Taylor, who testified alongside State Department official George Kent in the probe's first public hearing yesterday. During his opening statement, Ambassador Taylor testified about a July 26th phone conversation that happened just one day after Trump's controversial call with the president of Ukraine. Watch.
In the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
Two sources tell NBC News that the aide who overheard the phone call inside that Ukrainian restaurant is David Holmes, the counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. He is expected to testify behind closed doors tomorrow. Should be interesting.
Well, I mean, what's going to be really interesting?
What phone were they on? A burner phone? I mean, what phone were they on?
No, what's so funny is that the Republicans are now going back to what they tried at the beginning of this process with the whistleblower. And at the beginning of the process, they said, oh, it's hearsay, it's hearsay. You can't trust the hearsay. It's hearsay. Of course, poor Lindsey, obviously, wherever he went to law school, they didn't have an evidence class. But they say, hearsay, hearsay. And then the Democrats rolled out a plethora of witnesses who proved it wasn't hearsay and that it was firsthand evidence. So what did Republicans then say? Oh, we can't move forward until we hear the hearsay. We can't move forward until we get the whistleblower here, who, of course, they were saying had hearsay. And so, Willie, the same thing's going to happen here now. Oh, the phone call, it's secondhand, third hand, fourth hand. This is terrible. This is stupid. And you can see it, as my old torts professor, Professor Pearson would say, like a freight train slowly coming at you out of the mist. You know what's going to happen? They're going to hear testimony from the person that was at the table, and it will no longer be hearsay. So the dog continues to chase its tail, and all we can do is sit back look down, amused, shaking our heads because the Republicans have no defense.
And let's remember, we don't even have to wait for that. The hearsay argument blew up when Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified, when he gave a deposition, because he was on the phone call.
Right.
That was firsthand. And let's add in something else on the hearsay question. A lot of the firsthand witnesses have been blocked from testifying in these proceedings. Blocked by who? By the White House and by the State Department. So the hearsay argument does not hold up. Matt Miller, some of the other arguments made yesterday that the aid was released. Well, it was released because the whistleblower report came out and the hand was forced by the White House was forced. Also, that Ukraine didn't know the aid had been held up. That's blown up, we know, by reporting from the New York Times that Ukraine knew in early August about that. Argument after argument, I guess when you don't have the facts on your side, when you know you're in a corner, you present these arguments to the public who may not have heard them already, that we all know from reporting and from firsthand testimony have all been blown up and undermined already.
Yeah, I was surprised at how ineffective the Republican response was yesterday. We know that the facts they're working with aren't very good. They don't have a lot of factual defenses. But if you've watched kind of Republican conspiracy theories in the past, Benghazi or Fast and Furious, you know, they usually will take one conspiracy theory and stick with it. Yeah. And yesterday they were kind of picking together all these disparate points and not really weaving them together in any kind of coherent narrative. And I thought that was a problem for them. I think this new information that Ambassador Taylor testified to and that a member of his staff is going to come testify to in private tomorrow was really devastating. Number one, it knocks out this new argument they were trying to advance that the president just cared about corruption in Ukraine, which was always absurd. If you read that call transcript, he doesn't care about corruption in Ukraine. He didn't bring up any reforms to the prosecutor's office. He only cares about Joe Biden. But I think it was also really important because it really jams Gordon Sondland, who in some ways is going to be a key witness, because Gordon Sondland, his previous testimony said he didn't know, he had no idea that Burisma meant Joe Biden. He never heard anyone talk about Joe Biden until after the call transcript was released in September. And now you've got Gordon Sondland, you know, a witness who's going to come in and say that is flat out untrue. And I think it puts Gordon Sondland in a really difficult position. And if I were him, I'd be worried about coming clean and telling the truth about what I know about my conversations with the president when I come up next week.
Yeah, I mean, he's got to worry about perjury. He's also got to worry about lying under oath. The guy does not want to end up in jail because he lied for Donald Trump. He can just call Michael Cohen and find out that doesn't work very well. John Meacham, let's key in also on a couple of arguments that the Republicans made yesterday that are just preposterous, and that is, well, the aid, they ended up getting the aid anyway. So this extortion didn't work. Of course, we can look at, you know, FBI often kicks down doors and arrests conspirators while they're making the bomb or planning the bank robbery. It's still a crime. And of course, historically, Watergate, not a successful burglary, a third-rate botched burglary that brought down an entire government. Just because Donald Trump failed at extorting the Ukrainians doesn't mean it's not impeachable.
And in Watergate, if the burglary was third rate, as Ron Ziegler said, the cover-up was fourth or fifth rate, because it pretty self-evidently didn't work, because here we are talking about it. And President Nixon went back to San Clemente. So, whoops. But still impeachable. You had Republican support for the first article, which was about the cover-up, the attempted destruction of justice, which is the more serious term. I don't think I watched a great deal of yesterday, and I kept, you know, trying, because we're ordered by the Enlightenment example to keep an open mind, to weigh contrary evidence. But there just wasn't any contrary evidence to the idea that the president has abused his power in a remarkable way. I thought one of the great moments, which was, and I loved, Mika, we haven't mentioned this, that your father was mentioned as a paragon, as was Henry Kissinger for George Kent. But, you know, looking at Undersecretary Kent and Ambassador Taylor, you know, you sort of saw the ghosts of Dean Acheson and Robert Lovett up against these guys on the Republican side, these contestants from The Apprentice. You had this cultural clash between the wise men of the old era and these wise guys, and I think that's a hugely revealing cultural point here, is that they were playing by a certain set of rules, and it was about memos, and it was about listening when they were in the room with foreign leaders and trying to execute American policy over parties of presidents of different parties. A universe that many of us were accustomed to, not always right. Vietnam, not so great. So the long history of this is mixed, but that's what human nature is like. But you had this world of facts and policy and a kind of, and I don't want to overplay the dignity part, but a dignity about and a seriousness about the American experiment up against guys who were talking about conspiracy theories that I found myself Googling, and they went pretty much to the same places. So my own sense is the facts are the facts. Whether congressmen and senators are going to say, you know what, this is what it is, that's where we are.
Yeah.
The divide actually is even sharper. You could do a divide between a literate testimony and an illiterate defense by Republicans who obviously, and just to be fair to the Republicans, they've promised to be illiterate. They've promised not to read reports. They've promised to go in and to be stupid when these hearings start, and that's at least one promise that they fulfilled. But while you had witnesses testifying about facts and being as straightforward as possible and talking about U.S. foreign policy, you had the Republican side dredging up Facebook conspiracy theories that really, it wasn't a fair intellectual fight. And there was a divide between the literate and the illiterate. Those who've spent their entire life trying to better themselves, to forward U.S. foreign policy, and those who promised Americans that they were not going to read or be prepared for these hearings. And, well, that's exactly what happened, Mika.
It was hard to watch some of these incredible public servants get treated with such disrespect. Ambassador.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.